They branded 31-year-old Nora Delaney a poisoner in the town square of Crestfall, Manitoba, on a Thursday morning in October of 1891, and not one person in that crowd stepped forward to say it wasn't true. The sign they hung above her read "Murderess," painted in black letters thick as a man's thumb. She stood with her wrists tied to the post outside the magistrate's office, her dark hair loose and tangled from where they had dragged her from the boarding house before dawn. Her dress was the color of old cream. By noon, it was the color of dust. Nora had not poisoned anyone. The man who died was Douglas Hearn, the mill owner, and he had died of his own greed. 3 bottles of cheap laudanum mixed with whiskey, which anyone with sense knew would stop a heart by morning. But Douglas Hearn's brother was Aldous Hearn, who held the land deeds to half of Crestfall, and Aldous Hearn needed someone to blame who had no one to defend her. Nora had worked as the mill's bookkeeper. She had been inside the Hearn house. She had no husband, no father still living, no money saved beyond 6 months of careful wages. In Crestfall, that meant she had no armor at all, so they tied her to the post and they left her there. Men who owed Douglas Hearn money walked past and looked at the dirt when they passed her. Women who had sat beside her at church suppers pulled their children to the far side of the road. Nobody met her eyes. Nobody said her name. That was how it worked in a town like Crestfall. Aldous Hearn didn't need to prove anything. He only needed to say it loud enough, long enough, that people stopped asking questions. By mid-afternoon, Nora's legs were shaking. She had not eaten since the night before. The rope at her wrists had raised red welts. A boy of about 7 came close and stared at her, and she looked back at him calmly, because she refused to weep in front of any of them. The boy's mother appeared and snatched his arm and hurried him away without a word. Nora watched the empty road and thought, "I am going to die here if someone doesn't stop this." But the road offered nothing. Only wind off the lake, carrying the smell of cold water and coming snow. 3 days earlier, Nora had heard something she was not meant to hear. She had stayed late at the mill offices to reconcile a ledger that hadn't balanced in weeks. She was good at numbers. She had always been good at numbers. It was Douglas Hearn himself who had hired her on that strength, though he never let her forget she was an unusual appointment. That evening, she heard voices through the wall of the back office. One voice was Douglas. The other was his brother Aldous. "You've been moving money out of the mill accounts for 8 months, Douglas said. "I have the figures right here, every adjustment, every false entry. You've been bleeding this business since February." Aldous's voice came back low and smooth. "That's a bold claim from a man who can barely read the ledger. Nora reads it for me." She brought it to my attention. A silence. Then Aldous said very quietly, "Did she?" It was not a question. Nora had set down her pen. She had gathered her coat. She had walked out the side door into the dark and gone straight back to her room at Bet Kinsley's boarding house, where she had sat on the edge of her bed and tried to decide what to do. She had decided to say nothing until she could speak to someone with authority outside of Crestfall. A lawyer, perhaps. Someone not connected to the Hearn family. But Douglas Hearn was dead by morning, and by noon, Aldous Hearn had gone to the magistrate with a story about a bookkeeper who had brought laudanum-laced tea to his brother's study and watched him drink it. The magistrate, a man named Price who had borrowed money from Aldous 4 years ago and never repaid it, signed the papers before supper. No one asked Nora for her account. No one asked her anything at all. Crestfall sat in the bend of the Assiniboine River, a mill town that had grown fast in the 1880s and was already contracting by the time the decade closed. The rail spur had gone south instead of through town. 2 of the 3 merchants on the main street were carrying debt they couldn't service. The only things growing were the Hearn land holdings and the fear of losing them. Aldous Hearn did not own Crestfall the way a king owns a country. He owned it the way a frost owns a field, invisibly through cold, through the slow suffocation of options. He held mortgages. He extended credit at interest that would squeeze a family over a decade. He sat on the school board and the water council and the board that appointed the magistrate. He was not a man you accused. He was a weather system. You endured him or you left. Most people endured him. Most people were watching Nora Delaney tied to a post and telling themselves it had nothing to do with them. The man who stopped was named Ward Callum, and he had not been planning to stop for anything. He was 43 years old, and he owned the Callum homestead 12 miles north of Crestfall, on a section of land that backed onto spruce bush and felt like the edge of the world in winter. He had come into town for flour and harness oil and a winter weight blanket, because his old one had finally given up the previous spring and he'd been too careless about replacing it. Ward was not a man people talked about much. He kept to himself. He paid his bills and nodded when nodded to, and didn't linger. He had buried his wife, Eleanor, 4 years ago. Pneumonia, February, and a doctor who arrived 2 days too late. After that, he had sold off 60 acres of the homestead and dismissed his hired hand and just worked the land himself, smaller and quieter, because smaller and quieter was all he could manage. He had learned to stop wanting things. It was easier. He was riding back through Crestfall with his purchases tied behind the saddle when he saw the crowd gathered near the magistrate's office. He didn't mean to slow down. He told himself he was just letting a dog cross the road. Then he saw her. She was standing upright, which surprised him. He'd expected someone defeated. Instead, she was holding herself straight from the waist up, chin level, eyes open. Though her face was drained of color and her wrists had gone dark with bruising, she looked like a woman who had decided that, if this was what they were going to do to her, she would watch it happen clearly. Ward looked at the sign above her head. He looked at the rope at her wrists. He looked at the crowd of people who were finding other things to look at. Then he looked at her again. She had noticed him watching. She didn't ask anything of him. That was what he would think about later. Every other face in that square was either looking away or looking to see what he'd do next. But Nora Delaney looked at him the way a person looks at the horizon when they've given up on rescue, not asking, just watching, because what else is there? Ward dismounted. He took his knife from his belt, the small one, the folding one he used for cutting bale twine, and he walked to the post and he cut the rope. Someone in the crowd said, "Callum, you don't want to do this." Ward didn't answer. He caught Nora's arm as she swayed, and for a moment she was very still, as though her body had forgotten what it meant to be held upright by something other than her own will. "Can you stand?" he asked. Her voice came out rougher than he expected. "I've been standing for 6 hours. That's not what I asked." A pause. "Not for much longer." He kept his hand on her arm. "My horse is just there. I'm going to help you onto it. You'll lose your land," she said, not as a warning, just as information she felt he deserved to have. Ward had thought of that. He had thought of Eleanor's garden, still coming up with the volunteer dill every summer. He had thought of the view from the north pasture at first light, the way the spruce line went gold. He had thought of all the reasons to put his knife away and ride home. "I've already lost the things that mattered," he said. "Your name isn't Thief." He helped her onto the horse. Behind them, the murderess sign swung once in the wind and was still. The Callum homestead sat low against the land, sheltered by a windbreak of spruce on the north side and a creek on the west. The house was plain. 2 rooms with a lean-to addition Ward had built himself. But it was solid, and it was warm, and it smelled of wood smoke and dried sage and the faint old sweetness of a life that had once had more people in it. Ward carried Nora inside and laid her on the cot in the lean-to. He brought water first, then broth from the pot that was always on the back of the stove. Then he looked at her wrists, cleaned them without comment, and wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a clean shirt. Nora watched him do all of this. She did not say thank you immediately, which he found he respected. She drank the water slowly, the way someone does when their body can't quite remember it's safe to stop being careful. "You don't know me," she said. "No," Ward said. "You could have ridden past." "Yes." She studied him. Why didn't you? Ward was quiet for a moment. He thought about Eleanor, who would have been off that horse and cutting that rope before he'd even stopped thinking about it. He thought about how he'd been riding past things for 4 years, keeping his head down, keeping himself small and safe, and how it had not made him feel safe at all. Just empty. My wife would have, he said finally, and I've been a long time not doing the things she would have done. Nora said nothing to that. She just looked at him steadily, as though she was deciding something. I'm not a murderer, she said. I know. You can't possibly know that. You don't know me at all. I know what a guilty face looks like, Ward said. And I know what a face looks like, what face looks like when a person is holding themselves upright because they've decided they won't let them see them fall. Nora looked away from him, her jaw tightened. He moved money out of the mill accounts for months. Douglas found out. I found it first. Aldous needed someone to put this on. You told Aldous you knew? Douglas told him. The night Douglas died. Ward sat down in the chair across from her. Then we need to find whoever else knows what you know. There's no one. There's never no one, he said. There's only people who haven't been asked the right way yet. He was wrong about one thing. He thought Aldous Hearn would wait a day before sending men out. He sent them the same evening. Ward heard the horses before he saw them. 3 riders coming up the track, 2 of them with rifles across their saddles. He stepped outside with his shotgun and stood in the yard while the door behind him was still open. Nora came and stood in the doorway. The lead rider was Magistrate Price's deputy, a thin man named Fletcher Cook. He pointed at the house. Ward Callum, you're harboring a fugitive from justice. Hand her over or we'll have your deed reviewed by Monday. Ward's voice was level. She's not a fugitive. She was held without trial and I cut her loose. You're welcome to bring a judge from Winnipeg and do this properly. Hearn'll have your land, then come take it. Nora stepped down off the porch and stood beside Ward, not behind him, beside him. Fletcher Cook looked at her and then at Ward and then at the shotgun. You'll regret this, he said. I regret a lot of things, Ward said. This isn't going to be one of them. The riders left. Nora stood in the yard a long moment after the dust settled. Her hands were shaking. Ward could see it from where he stood. You were frightened, he said. Yes. She didn't look at him. But I am finished letting fear make my decisions for me. She turned back toward the house, and Ward followed her inside, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and Nora told him everything she knew. Ward listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I believe you. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright. Belief won't be enough. No, he agreed. But it's where we start. She straightened. There's a woman named Besi Prout who does the Hearn household laundry. She worked in the mill offices for a year before they let her go. She would have seen the ledgers. Anyone else? Terrence Mull drives the freight wagon between Crestfall and Portage. Aldous pays him to carry certain crates separately from the manifests. He knows what's being moved and when. That's 2. Gordon Finch at the land office keeps the copies of every deed transfer in the district. He told me once, after too much rye, that Hearn had changed the terms on several mortgages after they were signed. He was ashamed of it. He hasn't slept well since. 3, Ward said. And the mill ledger itself? Nora looked at him carefully. I have the key to the back office. I've had it for 3 years. Douglas gave it to me when he started trusting me with the accounts. Ward looked at her. I haven't told anyone, she said. I didn't know if there was any point. There's a point now. She reached inside the collar of the borrowed shirt she was wearing and drew out a key on a cord. Small, iron, worn smooth at the top from years of handling. Ward reached across the table, not for her hand, for the key. He held it a moment in his palm. We'll go into town, he said, together, and you'll walk into that square yourself. She met his eyes. You don't have to come, I know. He set the key back on the table between them. I'm coming. They spent 2 days preparing. Ward rode out to Besi Prout's house on the edge of town while Nora rested. Besi was a wide-shouldered woman. with ink-stained fingers, and a face that had learned to give nothing away. She opened the door and looked at Ward and said, before he could speak, "I heard you cut her loose. You heard right." Besi looked past him at the road, as though Aldous Hearn might materialize from the tree line. Then she stepped back and let him in. She told him what she knew. Aldous had been altering purchase orders through the mill accounts for at least a year, recording payments for lumber that was never delivered, materials that existed only on paper. The difference went into a separate set of books. She had seen the second set once by accident, left open on the desk when she came in to deliver the clean linens. "Why didn't you say something?" Ward asked. Besi looked at her hands. "I have 3 children. I have no husband. Aldous Hearn controls whether my children eat this winter, and if he does this again to someone else." She was quiet a long time. "That's why you're here." "Yes." She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand. "I'll speak." Terrence Mull was harder. He was a big, slow-spoken man who had been making extra money on Hearn's off-manifest freight for 3 years, and he knew that speaking out meant not only Hearn's fury but the exposure of his own involvement. Ward sat with him on the tailgate of his wagon for an hour, before Mull said anything at all. What finally moved him was Ward describing Nora tied to the post for 6 hours in October cold. "I drove past that morning," Mull said. He said it the way a man confesses something at a deathbed. "I looked at her and I kept driving." "I know," Ward said. "I almost did too." Mull looked at the sky. Then he looked at his boots. "I'll speak," he said. "God help me." Gordon Finch came to the homestead himself on the second day, arriving just before dark on a gray horse. He was a neat, careful man who wore his distress like a poorly fitted coat, visible at the seams. He sat in Ward's kitchen and drank coffee and could barely look at Nora. I knew it wasn't right," he said. "The changes to those mortgages. A family named Culloden, they lost their section last spring because Hearn claimed they'd defaulted on terms they'd never agreed to. I had the originals. I should have." He stopped. "I should have said something then." "Tell us what you can prove," Nora said. Her voice was not unkind. He told them. He had kept copies. He had them at home in a locked box, not out of courage but out of the dim instinct of a man who suspected he might need them someday. He would bring them to the square. "I'm not a brave man," he said. "Brave people are just frightened people who moved anyway," Nora said. "I was terrified this whole year. I was terrified when they tied me to that post. I was more terrified when they untied me, because at least when I was in that square I knew what was happening to me." Gordon looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Market Saturday in Crestfall meant wagons from the surrounding homesteads, the Métis families from along the river road, the mill workers on their half-day. Square filled slowly, the way it always did, with the particular smell of wood smoke and cold air and horses and fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. Aldous Hearn arrived at 10 in the morning and stood at the top of the magistrate's steps in his dark wool coat, his gloves already on, watching the crowd the way he always watched things, with the calm assurance of a man who has never had reason to believe a situation might turn against him. Ward and Nora rode in from the North Road. The square went quiet the moment someone recognized them. The quiet spread outward, person to person, until even the horses seemed to be holding still. Aldous lifted his voice. "People of Crestfall, you see before you a woman who fled justice and the man who harbored her. I expect the law too." "The law was never involved," Nora said. She spoke clearly, and her voice carried across the square without effort. The way a voice does when a person has decided there is nothing left to lose by being heard. "There was no trial. There was no evidence presented. There were no witnesses. There was only your word, Aldous, against a woman you needed to be guilty." A murmur moved through the crowd. Aldous' expression didn't change. "You have no standing here. I was standing in this square tied to a post," Nora said. "You made sure of that. I have more standing here than anyone." She reached into her coat and produced the key on its cord. "This is the key to the mill's back office. Douglas Hearn gave it to me 3 years ago when he trusted me with the accounts." She looked at the crowd. "And what the accounts show is that someone has been removing money from this mill for 8 months. Not the bookkeeper, the man who signs the deeds." Aldous stepped forward. "She's a murderer inventing lies too." "I washed the sheets in that office," said Besi Prout, stepping out of the crowd. Her voice shook, but it didn't stop. "I saw the second ledger, the one that doesn't match the one Nora kept." Silence. Terrence Mull walked forward from beside his wagon. "I drove freight for Hearn. Lumber loads that never showed on the manifest. He paid me not to ask. I'm asking now." Aldous turned to look at each of them in turn. His face was still composed, but something behind his eyes had gone careful. Then Gordon Finch climbed the steps beside Nora and opened the leather case he'd been carrying. "I have the original mortgage documents from the land office," he said, his voice thin but steady. "I have copies of what was filed, and I have proof that 17 mortgage terms were altered after signing, including the Culloden section that was foreclosed on in May." The square erupted. A woman near the back called out that her husband's mill contract had been changed after he signed it. A man by the grain store said Hearn had charged storage fees that weren't in any agreement. A farmer said he'd been paying interest on a debt that should have cleared 2 years ago. Ward stood near the bottom of the steps and watched it happen. He did not speak. He had offered the town a place to stand, and the town was standing. Aldous Hearn raised his hands. "This is slander. Every one of you will answer for." "No," said Magistrate Price, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. His voice was unsteady. He pushed forward until he was visible, a small man in a good coat who looked like he hadn't slept well in a long time. "No, Aldous, I think it's the other way." People turned to look at him. Price looked at Nora. He couldn't quite hold her gaze. "I signed papers I shouldn't have signed," he said. "I knew there was no proper evidence. I knew it, and I signed it anyway." He swallowed. "Nora Delaney is innocent of any charge." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a crowd understanding that what they believed was the shape of things has just been revealed as a costume. Aldous Hearn turned toward the road. 2 men from the crowd moved before he could reach his horse. A farmer named Whittle and a carpenter named Croft. Men who had been paying crooked interest for years, and they held his arms, and they waited. A constable rode in from Portage la Prairie by the following morning, summoned by a telegraph message Ward had sent 2 days earlier, just in case. He arrived to find Aldous Hearn in the Crestfall grain store, under the watch of 6 men who had decided that this particular man was not going anywhere. The constable read the evidence Gordon Finch presented. He reviewed the ledgers that Nora unlocked from the mill office. He reviewed Terrence Mull's statement. Aldous Hearn was taken to Portage la Prairie in handcuffs, in a wagon driven by Terrence Mull, who had never looked so relieved to be driving anywhere in his life. He was tried the following March and convicted on 7 counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years. He served 6. He came back to Crestfall once, some years later, and found nothing waiting for him. The mill had been reorganized as a cooperative. The mortgage ledgers had been audited and the crooked debts struck out. The Cullodens had their section back. He left again and did not return. That night, people came to the Callum homestead. Not many, at first. Besi Prout brought her children. Gordon Finch arrived with a covered dish. Terrence Mull came with firewood, which Ward accepted without comment. Then, a family from the River Road came, and a pair of mill workers who'd been afraid that morning, but afraid to speak that morning, but had spoken in the afternoon, and by dark the yard was lit, with lanterns borrowed from 3 different neighbors, and the kitchen table had been moved outside to hold the food people kept bringing. Ward stood at the edge of the yard and watched people fill a space that had been hollow for 4 years. Nora came beside him. "Is it too much?" she asked. He looked at the spruce line at the far edge of the property, the place where Eleanor had always said the deer came through at dawn. He thought she would have been in the middle of all of it, laughing at something, pressing food on people who said they weren't hungry. "No," he said. I think it's exactly right. Nora stood beside him quietly for a moment. Then she said, "You gave them a reason to come forward. You gave them the words," he said. "You gave them the place to stand." He looked at her. "We gave them that." She didn't answer. But she didn't disagree. The iron post where Nora had stood for 6 hours was pulled from the ground the following week. Nobody organized it. 3 men just showed up one morning with shovels and worked until it came free and laid it in the dirt. The blacksmith, a man named Harold Seff, who had watched the whole thing from his shop window on the morning Nora was tied there and had not come out, melted it down with the murderess sign's iron bracket and cast them into a new water pump for the schoolyard. He did not make a ceremony of it. He did not need to. The first morning children pumped water from it. The sound carried across Crestfall and down the road where Nora had spent the worst day of her life. The iron that had held a woman in public shame was now doing something ordinary and necessary and good. Harold said later that was the point, that things could be changed into other things if enough people were willing to do the work. Besi Prout took on the mill's bookkeeping while the cooperative was being organized. She was good at it, and she was trusted, and no one was surprised. Gordon Finch reorganized the land office records properly and published a notice in the Portage paper inviting anyone who believed their mortgage terms had been altered to come and review the originals. 43 families did. 31 found discrepancies. All 31 were corrected. Terrence Mull went on driving freight, but honestly, Anne slept better for it. In the spring, Ward asked Nora Delaney to marry him in the most unromantic way possible. They were mending the fence line along the creek, and he just said it, plainly, the way he said most things, and she stopped hammering and looked at him for a long moment. "You know I'm going to have opinions about how this place is run," she said. "I'm counting on it. And I'll want a proper window in the lean-to. That one faces the wrong direction. I built it myself." "I know." She went back to hammering. Then she stopped again. "Yes," she said. "All right." They were married in June at the homestead, with the creek running high from snowmelt, and the spruce bush coming green at the tips, and half of Crestfall standing in the yard, because Ward had given them a place to stand once, and they hadn't forgotten. Nora wore blue, not because anyone told her to, because she chose it. Gordon Finch cried at the vows, which surprised him and no one else. Besi Prout brought her children, and they ran in the yard until dark. Terrence Mull brought his fiddle, which no one knew he played, and turned out to be quite good. Ward stood in the yard in the evening with Nora's hand in his and watched the lanterns move through the dark between the trees, people finding their way toward light. "Eleanor would have liked this," he said. Nora squeezed his hand. "Tell me about her." He did. For the first time in 4 years, he told someone about her. How she laughed. How she was always cold and always stealing his coat. How she had named every one of the horses after characters from novels she'd read. How she had died on a Tuesday in February, and he had sat beside her until Wednesday. He talked until the yard emptied, and the lanterns went out one by one, and it was just the two of them, and the dark and the stars coming up cold and sharp above the spruce. He had thought that talking about her would feel like losing her again. It felt like carrying her differently, lighter, like something you'd been holding wrong and finally found the right grip. Nora listened without trying to fill the silences, which was exactly right. In the years that followed, people in Crestfall still talked about the October morning when a woman stood tied to a post and one quiet man stopped his horse. They didn't tell it as a story about crime or punishment or politics. They told it as a story about what happens when one person decides that what's happening in front of them is their concern. Because a whole town had looked away and one man had not. And that difference had changed everything. Not because Ward Callum was extraordinary. He would have said he was not. He would have said he was just a man who thought of his wife and asked himself what she would have done. But Nora, if you asked her, would tell you it was simpler than that. She would tell you that fear had built a cage around Crestfall for years, and that all it took to open it was one person refusing to walk past. And once the door was open, people remembered they had never wanted to be inside it. That is the thing about courage, she would say. It looks like a single action, but it lives in everything that follows.